My name is Major Emily Carter, and the last words my father ever spoke to me before I walked out of our family gathering were, "Take that uniform off before you ever call me Dad again." Every relative heard him. Every cousin froze. My grandmother dropped her fork. My mother burst into tears. Nobody at that table knew the woman standing in front of them had spent the past 15 years leading soldiers through firefights, overseas carrying wounded Americans to helicopters under enemy fire, and making impossible decisions that still visited her in the middle of the night. My father thought he was humiliating an obedient daughter. He had no idea he was declaring war against the strongest part of my life. I didn't answer him. I simply stood there in my dress. Army uniform, looked him straight in the eyes, and let the silence settle over the room. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if anything I could have said would have changed what happened next. Probably not. Some people have to discover the truth for themselves. The day began with every reason to believe it would become one of our happiest family memories. My grandmother was turning 80. She still lived in the same white farmhouse outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, where my mother had grown up. The wraparound porch sagged a little more each year, and the old oak tree in the front yard had survived more storms than anyone could count. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and milestone birthday seemed to happen under that roof. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years. The Army had kept me moving from one assignment to another with deployments and training exercises stretching farther than I ever imagined when I enlisted at 19. My work wasn't the kind that ended up in newspapers. Much of it couldn't even be discussed around family. Whenever relatives asked what I did, I usually smiled and answered, "I'm still with the Army." That was enough, or at least I thought it was. The drive from Fort Campbell to my grandmother's house felt strangely peaceful. Kentucky looked exactly the way I remembered it, rolling green fields, tobacco barns, leaning with age horses grazing behind weathered fences, church steeples rising above little towns where everyone still waved from pickup trucks. I rolled down the window and breathed in warm September air. For a few hours, I wanted to forget combat zones, classified briefings, and the constant weight of responsibility. I just wanted to be Emily. My grandmother greeted me before I even parked. "There she is," she shouted, hurrying across the yard much faster than an 80-year-old probably should. She hugged me tightly. "I've missed you every single day." "I've missed you too, Grandma." She held my face with both hands. "You look tired." I laughed. "I've heard that before. That's because it's true." Inside the house, relatives filled every room. Aunts, uncles, second cousins, children running through the hallway. Someone was watching college football in the living room, while others argued over whether the barbecue needed more sauce. For a while, everything felt normal. People hugged me, asked harmless questions. "How long are you home? When's your next assignment?" "Still enjoying Army life," I answered politely. Then I saw my father. Richard Carter stood near the kitchen window holding a glass of iced tea. He gave me one quick nod. No hug, no smile, nothing. That wasn't unusual. Growing up, my father had always believed daughters should stay close to home. He spent 38 years supervising a machine shop before retiring. He believed in hard work, discipline, and keeping emotions private. Those qualities weren't the problem. The problem was that he believed military service belonged to men. When I enlisted after high school, he didn't speak to me for almost 6 months. When I graduated from officer candidate school, he skipped the ceremony. When I made captain, he mailed a card with only 3 words written inside. "Be careful, Dad." It was the closest thing to affection we'd shared in years. Despite everything, I kept hoping time would soften him. Maybe retirement would help. Maybe age would. Maybe seeing me build a respectable career would. I was wrong. Dinner began with laughter. Grandma insisted everyone squeeze around 2 long tables pushed together in the dining room. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, homemade biscuits. The smell alone reminded me of childhood. Grandma raised her glass. "I'm thankful we're all together again." Everyone cheered. For 20 minutes, conversation stayed light. Then my cousin Mark asked the question that changed everything. "So Emily," he said, "what rank are you now?" "I'm a major." Several relatives congratulated me. Before I could answer another question, my father leaned back in his chair. "A major," he repeated. His voice carried across the room. "So they really are handing those jobs to women now?" The room went quiet. I forced a small smile. "I earned it." He shrugged. "I'm sure you did paperwork real well." A few uncomfortable chuckles came from the far end of the table. My mother looked down at her plate. Grandma frowned. "Dad," I said carefully, "I'd rather not argue today." "I'm not arguing." He took another drink. "I'm stating facts." I stayed silent. He continued anyway. "Women don't belong in combat." Nobody moved. You've spent 15 years pretending you're something you're not. I could feel everyone's eyes shifting between us. I serve where the army assigns me, I answered. You should have married, had children, settled down. I chose another path. No, he snapped. You chose to embarrass this family. Grandma spoke softly. Richard, that's enough. But he ignored her. He pointed directly at the ribbons on my uniform. I don't care how many medals they pin on you. His voice grew louder. That uniform doesn't make you honorable. The room felt smaller. I could hear silverware stop clinking. Even the children had gone silent. Then came the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If you're going to wear that uniform, he shouted, take it off before you ever call me Dad again. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Someone whispered, oh my God. Grandma stood up. Richard, but I raised one hand gently toward her. It's okay. I stood slowly. My chair scraped across the hardwood floor. I looked around the room. Some relatives couldn't meet my eyes. Others looked embarrassed for him. Not one person spoke. I turned back to my father. He expected me to cry, to argue, to beg. Instead, I stood at attention. Then I rendered him a crisp military salute. My voice remained calm. I hope one day you'll understand what this uniform truly stands for. I lowered my hand, picked up my overnight bag, walked through the front door. Nobody tried to stop me. Outside, the evening air felt cooler than before. I placed my bag in the trunk, started my car, and drove away from the only home I'd ever known. The farmhouse disappeared behind me. I told myself I wouldn't cry. I almost succeeded. About 20 minutes later, while driving south toward Fort Campbell, my government-issued secure phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. The screen displayed only 2 words, the Pentagon. I pulled onto the shoulder, took a steady breath, and answered. Major Carter speaking. The familiar voice on the other end said only one sentence. Major, your presence is required in Washington immediately. Everything is about to change. The blue lights of Washington shimmered beneath the descending aircraft as I stared through the small oval window and wondered whether the hardest battle of my life had really happened around my grandmother's dining room table instead of halfway across the world. The call from the Pentagon had been brief. No explanations, no details. Only a direct order to report immediately. After 15 years in uniform, I had learned that when someone at that level said, everything is about to change, you packed your bag, boarded the first available military flight, and asked questions later. The pain of what my father had said still echoed in my mind, but military discipline has a strange way of compartmentalizing emotions. You don't stop feeling them, you simply place them on a shelf until the mission is over. As the transport landed at Joint Base Andrews just after midnight, a black government SUV was already waiting. The driver stepped out before I even reached the curb. Major Carter. Yes. He nodded. They're expecting you. Nothing more. No small talk. No curiosity. That was another thing I'd grown used to. Some assignments came wrapped in silence. By 1:30 that morning, I was sitting inside a secure conference room at the Pentagon. The room wasn't large, but every face around the polished table belonged to someone whose decisions affected thousands of service members. A lieutenant general, 2 civilian officials from the Department of Defense, a colonel from Army Public Affairs, and my commanding officer, Lieutenant General Thomas Harrington. He stood as I entered. At ease, Major. I saluted. He returned it. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. You've had quite a week already. You could say that, sir. He studied my face for a second longer than usual. You look exhausted. I've had worse days. I know. He motioned toward a chair. Sit down. Once everyone was seated, the civilian official nearest the screen opened a classified presentation. Major Carter, she began, the department has completed another review of several operations conducted between 2017 and 2023. I listened carefully. Those years covered most of my overseas deployments. Certain portions, she continued, have now been approved for partial declassification. My heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. Because I knew exactly what that meant. Stories that had remained buried for years were finally allowed to be told. Not every detail. Not every location. But enough. Lieutenant General Harrington folded his hands. There will be a national military recognition ceremony next week. I nodded. We'd like you to attend. I'll be honored, sir. He looked directly into my eyes. No, Major. He paused. We'd like you to be one of the people we're honoring. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Soldiers don't usually think about recognition. You think about getting everyone home. You think about tomorrow's briefing, the next convoy, the next helicopter, the next casualty notification. Awards come later. Sometimes years later. Sometimes never. I don't know what to say, sir. You don't have to say anything. He smiled again. You already did. One of the civilians advanced the presentation. A satellite image appeared. Snow-covered mountains. A narrow valley. An extraction route? Even after all these years, I recognized it instantly. Afghanistan. Winter. Altitude over 9,000 feet. One of the worst nights of my career. The room became quiet. We can now publicly acknowledge, the official explained, that you led the emergency extraction of 53 American and Allied personnel after their forward operating position became surrounded. The words sounded strangely clinical. They didn't mention the freezing wind, the broken radios, the soldiers bleeding into the snow, or the helicopter pilot who told me landing would probably get everyone killed. Instead, my mind drifted back to that night. Visibility had been terrible. Enemy fire echoed through the mountains. One of my staff sergeants kept insisting we had to leave before daylight. "We're out of time, Major. We're out of options." I remember looking at him and answering words that stayed with our unit long afterward. "No, we're out of excuses. Nobody gets left behind. Not while I can still stand." We made 3 more trips through enemy fire. 3. The official voice in the conference room pulled me back. 21 wounded personnel survived because additional extraction flights were authorized. Authorized. That was one way to describe it. The truth was much simpler. I had refused to leave. General Harrington leaned toward me. I argued with Washington that night. I looked at him. "I remember, sir. They told me the risk wasn't acceptable." I smiled faintly. "You told them I wasn't asking." His laugh filled the room. "I believe those were my exact words." Several people smiled. Another slide appeared. Different country. Different year. A crowded airfield. Thousands of frightened civilians. This operation had never been discussed outside secure channels. As international forces withdrew from a collapsing region, panic spread faster than official planning. Families flooded the airport. Children became separated from parents. Crowds pushed against barriers until soldiers struggled simply to keep people breathing. Our unit had been sent to help stabilize the evacuation. For nearly 72 hours, none of us slept more than a few minutes at a time. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, had refused to let go of my sleeve because she thought everyone wearing camouflage could keep monsters away. I still remembered her tiny hand. Sometimes memories like that hurt more than firefights. The civilian official continued. "Several humanitarian actions performed by your task force will now be publicly recognized." I nodded quietly. The room remained respectful. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody dramatized. Military people rarely do. General Harrington slid a folder across the table. Inside were draft remarks planned for next week's ceremony. I skimmed them. Too generous. Far too generous. I looked up. "Sir, this wasn't just me. We know. There were outstanding NCOs. We know. Pilots. We know. Medics. We know." He interrupted gently. "That's exactly why they're all being recognized, too." I relaxed a little. That mattered. No officer accomplishes anything alone. Not in combat. Not ever. After the meeting ended, General Harrington asked me to remain. Once everyone else left, he closed the conference room door. His voice softened. "Everything okay?" "Yes, sir." He waited. Military leaders learn patience over decades. Eventually, I sighed. I had dinner with my family yesterday, and my father disowned me. Silence. "I'm sorry." He told me to take off my uniform before I ever called him Dad again. General Harrington looked down for a long moment. "I've commanded soldiers for 38 years. He finally spoke. "I've written too many letters to families who never saw their sons or daughters come home." He met my eyes. "I've also learned something." "What's that, sir?" "Sometimes the people who love us the most understand our service the least." I thought about those words all afternoon. Perhaps he was right. My father had never seen what this uniform actually represented. To him it was rebellion, distance, lost family holidays, missed birthdays, everything the army had supposedly taken from him. He had never seen what it had given me. Purpose, responsibility, brothers and sisters willing to risk everything for one another. Before I left, General Harrington asked one final question. "Will your family attend next week's ceremony?" I looked out the window toward the Potomac River. The answer came easily. "No, sir. I don't think they'd want to." He nodded without pressing further. What neither of us knew was that hundreds of miles away in Kentucky, my grandmother was quietly making a telephone call of her own. She had spent the entire night thinking about what happened at her birthday dinner. Finally, just after breakfast, she picked up the phone, found the number for Army Public Affairs, and introduced herself in the gentle voice everyone in town recognized. "My granddaughter won't ask," she said, "but I'd like to know if there's any way her father could attend that ceremony." The woman on the other end listened carefully. Then she asked for Richard Carter's full name. Grandma smiled through tears. I think it's time he learned who his daughter really is. The invitation arrived in my parents' mailbox on a quiet Tuesday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery store flyer. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with the seal of the Department of the Army embossed in gold. My mother later told me she recognized it immediately, but she was afraid to open it without my father. He found it sitting on the kitchen table after finishing breakfast. "What in the world is this?" he muttered. My mother shrugged. "It came this morning." He turned it over, studying the official seal. "For us, so it seems." He carefully opened the envelope, expecting, as he would later admit, some routine notice connected to my career. Instead, he unfolded a formal invitation requesting the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Carter at a military recognition ceremony at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., honoring distinguished service members whose previously classified operations had recently been approved for public recognition. There was also a handwritten note. "We sincerely hope your family can attend this important occasion." No signature, just those words. My father frowned. "They must send these things to everyone's parents." My mother quietly read the invitation again. "I don't think so." He shrugged. "Probably just another promotion ceremony." My grandmother happened to stop by that afternoon with a peach cobbler she'd baked. She acted surprised when my mother mentioned the invitation. "Oh," Grandma said, trying not to smile too much. "Well, maybe you ought to go." "I don't know," my father answered. "Seems like a long drive for a speech and a handshake." Grandma looked him directly in the eye. "Some moments only come once." For reasons he couldn't explain, my father agreed. Not enthusiastically, not proudly, simply because something about the invitation unsettled him. 3 days later, they loaded my father's aging Ford F-150 and began the long drive from Kentucky toward Washington, D.C. Grandma insisted on riding with them. "So I can finally see where my granddaughter works," she said. The trip took most of the day. Interstate 64 gave way to the rolling hills of West Virginia before eventually joining the traffic flowing toward Northern Virginia. My mother watched the scenery. Grandma admired the changing mountains, my father complained. "I still don't understand why all this fuss is necessary." Nobody answered. After several miles, he spoke again. "I'll tell you one thing." Grandma folded her hands. "What?" "I still don't believe women belong in combat." The truck became quiet. My mother stared out her window. Grandma answered gently. "Maybe you don't know as much about Emily's work as you think." "I know enough." "No?" She smiled sadly. "I don't believe you do." The conversation ended there. Late that evening, they checked into a modest hotel in Arlington, Virginia. My father had never visited the nation's capital before. The next morning after breakfast, they crossed the Potomac River. Washington looked nothing like the small towns he'd spent his life in. Government buildings stretched in every direction. Flags waved from massive stone structures. Uniformed personnel seemed to be everywhere. Traffic moved with determined purpose. When the Pentagon finally came into view, even my father grew quiet. "I didn't realize it was this big," he admitted. "It almost looks like a city." "It practically is," Grandma answered. Security procedures were thorough. Identification, vehicle inspection, escort. Everything happened with calm professionalism. My father whispered to my mother, "They sure don't fool around here." "No," she replied softly. "They don't." Inside the Pentagon, polished corridors stretched farther than seemed possible. Military history lined the walls. Portraits of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardians, and generations of leaders reminded visitors that millions had served before us. Families gathered outside the auditorium. Many wore suits. Others proudly displayed small lapel pins representing sons, daughters, husbands, or wives currently serving. Some older veterans wore campaign caps identifying conflicts dating back to Korea and Vietnam. One elderly man in a wheelchair caught my father's attention. The veteran noticed him looking. "You here for family?" he asked. My father nodded. "My daughter." The veteran smiled. "You must be proud." My father hesitated. "I suppose." The veteran laughed quietly. "My grandson's getting recognized today." His eyes shined with unmistakable pride. "I've waited 70 years to see another member of my family wear this country's uniform." Before my father could answer, the veteran's family wheeled him toward the entrance. Grandma watched them disappear. "That man understands something." "What? Gratitude?" My father said nothing. Meanwhile, I was backstage preparing with the other honorees. There were no speeches about glory, no dramatic music, just quiet conversations among people who had shared extraordinary experiences. Several soldiers I hadn't seen in years recognized me immediately. "Major Carter." A former combat medic hugged me. "I can't believe we're all here." Neither could I. One helicopter pilot laughed. I figured they'd keep all this buried forever. So did I. General Harrington walked over. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be, sir. He smiled. Your family's here. I froze. My family, they checked in about 15 minutes ago. For a brief second I couldn't breathe. My father came, so I'm told. I looked toward the auditorium doors. 1,000 thoughts collided at once. Why would he come? Did Grandma convince him? Would he leave halfway through? Would he still refuse to look at me? General Harrington placed one hand lightly on my shoulder. Whatever happens today, he paused. Let the truth do the talking. The ceremony began promptly at 10. The army band performed the national anthem. Everyone stood. The room settled into respectful silence. The master of ceremonies welcomed military leaders, veterans, families, and distinguished guests. Several recognitions came first. Acts of courage, medical heroism, humanitarian operations. Each story reminded everyone in the room that military service is rarely about one dramatic moment. It's usually about ordinary people making impossible decisions because someone has to. Then the announcer looked down at his notes. Ladies and gentlemen, I felt my pulse quicken. Our next recognition honors an officer whose leadership remained unknown to the American public for years due to operational security. The auditorium became completely still. In recently declassified operations, this officer commanded one of the most successful emergency rescue missions of the past 2 decades, preserving the lives of dozens of American and Allied personnel under extraordinary circumstances. My father slowly lifted his head. My mother gripped the edge of her seat. Grandma quietly closed her eyes. The announcer continued. Please welcome. There was one heartbeat of silence. Major Emily Carter, United States Army. Applause filled the auditorium. I walked toward the stage with measured steps, my dress uniform perfectly pressed, every ribbon earned through years my family had never truly understood. As I reached the podium, I glanced toward the audience. For the first time since our argument, my father's eyes met mine. The confidence he had worn all morning was gone. Confusion had replaced it. Disbelief. Questions he didn't yet know how to ask. He wasn't looking at the daughter he thought had spent 15 years behind a desk. He was looking at someone he had never really known. I thought the ceremony would proceed exactly as rehearsed. I was wrong. General Harrington unexpectedly rose from his front row seat before anyone called his name. He walked calmly toward the podium carrying a worn black mission folder secured with a red classification band that had only recently been removed. He placed it gently on the lectern. Then he looked out across the audience. There's something this country deserves to hear. And everything changed. General Harrington rested one hand on the worn mission folder for several seconds before speaking. The applause faded until the auditorium became so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. He looked neither at me nor at the audience at first. Instead, he looked at the folder. I've carried this file for almost 6 years, he said. For most of that time, I couldn't tell my own wife what was inside it. A few people smiled. Military families understood that kind of silence. We ask our service members to protect this nation, he continued. Sometimes we also ask them to carry secrets that prevent their own families from fully understanding what they've done. He slowly opened the folder. Today that changes. The large screen behind the stage lit up with a satellite image of a narrow mountain valley blanketed in snow. Even after all these years, seeing that image tightened something inside my chest. I remembered the cold. Not the ordinary kind of cold. The kind that cuts through gloves and body armor until your hands stop feeling like your own. General Harrington pointed toward a tiny cluster of buildings barely visible on the screen. On this night, 53 American and Allied personnel became trapped behind enemy lines after a coordinated attack cut off every planned evacuation route. The audience listened without moving. The original assessment concluded that further rescue attempts carried an unacceptable probability of total mission failure. He paused. In plain English, he looked directly at the crowd. Washington believed everyone still trapped there would probably die. A quiet murmur swept across the auditorium. Then another image appeared. This one showed helicopters flying through a mountain pass. The officer leading the extraction on the ground requested authorization for another attempt. He smiled faintly. When authorization was denied, she requested it again. I lowered my eyes. I remembered every word of those radio conversations. I had argued until my voice became hoarse. I wasn't trying to be brave. I simply knew there were still Americans waiting. General Harrington continued. When the denial came a second time, Major Carter informed her chain of command that she accepted full personal responsibility for continuing the rescue. Several retired officers in the audience exchanged glances. They knew exactly what that meant. If the mission failed, my career would almost certainly have ended. If more soldiers died, I would have carried that burden forever. But if we walked away, I already knew I couldn't live with that. The screen changed again. Now photographs of rescued service members appeared one after another. Faces, names, families, children who had since grown into teenagers. One young man stood from the audience, then another, then a woman wearing army dress blues. Without anyone asking them to, more than 24 people quietly rose to their feet. General Harrington gestured toward them. These men and women are alive today because someone refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. The room erupted into applause. Not loud, not wild, the kind of applause filled with gratitude. I wished every member of my unit could have been standing beside me, because none of us had survived alone. The general must have sensed exactly what I was thinking. He smiled toward me. Major Carter would be the first person to tell you this was never one person's victory. I nodded. He was right. He continued. Staff Sergeant Luis Martinez refused evacuation until every wounded soldier boarded first. Martinez stood. The audience applauded. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Brooks landed his helicopter 3 separate times under direct enemy fire. Brooks stood. More applause. Combat medic Angela Simmons treated casualties while receiving treatment herself. Angela smiled shyly as everyone recognized her. One by one, members of our team stood. Every face brought back memories, laughter shared between missions, letters from home, friends we had buried, victories no newspaper ever printed. Then General Harrington closed the folder halfway. There's another part of this story. The room became quiet again. Combat isn't measured only by bullets. His voice softened. It is measured by what follows soldiers home. He looked at me, then back at the audience. Major Carter completed every assignment placed before her. He paused. But she also attended memorial services for soldiers she couldn't save. I swallowed hard. The images returned immediately. Rows of boots, rifles planted upside down, helmets resting on top, folded flags, names carved into polished stone. General Harrington continued gently. She missed birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries, funerals, family milestones. Every sentence felt heavier. Like thousands of service members, she quietly accepted those sacrifices because someone had to. I noticed my mother wiping tears from her cheeks. She had known I missed holidays. She had never understood why. My father hadn't moved. His eyes remained fixed on the stage. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty replacing certainty. Perhaps he was remembering every family gathering where he'd complained that I never came home. Every birthday card that arrived late because mail had taken weeks to reach a remote base. Every holiday when an empty chair sat at the table. Perhaps he was finally asking himself where I'd actually been. General Harrington turned another page. A few years after the mountain rescue, Major Carter led a humanitarian evacuation during an international crisis. Photographs appeared showing frightened civilians boarding military aircraft. Children wrapped in blankets. Elderly couples holding hands. Families carrying everything they owned in backpacks. More than 800 civilians reached safety through coordinated operations involving American and Allied forces. He looked around the auditorium. Among them were over 200 children. No one applauded immediately. Some stories deserve silence first. Then came gentle applause once more. A retired Marine seated near the front slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Beside him, a Vietnam veteran nodded quietly. Older Americans understand sacrifice differently. Many had lived through wars. Some had fought them. Others had waited anxiously at home. None of them treated service lightly. General Harrington stepped away from the podium for a moment. When he returned, his expression had changed. Less formal. More personal. I've commanded soldiers for nearly 4 decades. He looked directly at me. I've met extraordinary leaders. Another pause. But very few possess the ability to remain calm when everyone else believes hope is gone. I felt my face grow warm. Praise has always made me uncomfortable. The soldiers beside me deserved just as much recognition. Then he spoke words I never expected. Many people are alive today because Major Emily Carter refused to leave anyone behind. The entire auditorium stood. Veterans. Families, senior officers, cabinet officials. The standing ovation rolled through the room like a wave. I searched the audience until I found my father. He was standing too, not because everyone else was. He looked almost unable to remain seated. His hands trembled slightly as he clapped. His face had lost every trace of anger. Instead, it held something I had waited 15 years to see. Understanding. Not complete, not yet, but beginning. The applause slowly faded. General Harrington raised one hand, asking everyone to sit. There is, he said quietly, one final acknowledgement that must be made today. He closed the mission folder. Then he looked toward the audience instead of toward me. His eyes settled on one specific seat. My next words, he said, are for someone who probably never imagined being part of this ceremony. I followed his gaze. It stopped on my father. General Harrington smiled gently. Mr. Richard Carter. My father's eyes widened. Would you please stand? Richard Carter looked around as though the general must have been speaking to someone else. He even glanced over his shoulder. There was no one behind him. My mother gently touched his arm. I think he means you. My father swallowed hard and slowly rose from his seat. His movements were stiff, almost uncertain, nothing like the confident man who had dominated my grandmother's dining room only a week earlier. More than 600 people watched him. 4-star generals, cabinet officials, combat veterans, Gold Star families, young soldiers, retired Marines wearing rows of faded ribbons. My father had spent his life avoiding attention. Now it had found him. General Harrington smiled kindly. Mr. Carter, thank you for standing. My father nodded but couldn't seem to find his voice. The general rested both hands on the podium. A week ago I was told your daughter attended a family gathering. I felt my stomach tighten. He wasn't going to. He couldn't possibly know. I also learned, he continued carefully, that there was disagreement within the family about what this uniform represents. The room remained completely silent. General Harrington wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. His tone carried no anger, only compassion. He looked directly at my father. Many Americans have never served. Many never had the opportunity to understand military life. That isn't a crime. My father lowered his eyes. But misunderstanding can become judgment. Another pause. And judgment can wound people we love. Then the general said something that made my father's shoulders visibly shake. Some people believe a military uniform hides weakness. He let those words hang in the air. Then he spoke again. I've spent nearly 40 years watching young Americans earn the right to wear this country's uniform. His voice grew stronger. I've never seen it hide weakness. I've seen it reveal character. Every veteran in the room nodded. General Harrington turned toward me. When Major Carter first became an officer, she wasn't the loudest. A few officers smiled. She wasn't the most decorated. Another smile. She wasn't the strongest runner. The audience chuckled softly. But she possessed something every commander hopes to find. He paused. When everyone else asked whether a mission could succeed, she asked who still needed to come home. I closed my eyes for just a second. Because that had always been the question. Not whether something was difficult. Whether someone was still waiting. General Harrington faced my father again. Mr. Carter, I don't know what conversations you've had with your daughter over the years. I don't know what disagreements you've carried, but I do know this. He pointed gently toward me. The woman standing on this stage represents the very best of the United States Army. The applause returned. Longer this time. Warmer. My father didn't clap. He simply stared. General Harrington continued. The Army teaches tactics. It teaches discipline. It teaches leadership. But it cannot teach integrity. He smiled. That begins long before a recruit ever arrives. He looked directly into my father's eyes. So whether you realize it or not, thank you. My father blinked. The general continued. Thank you for raising a daughter who never abandoned her soldiers. Thank you for raising someone who believed duty mattered. Thank you for raising an officer trusted with America's sons and daughters. I knew what my father was thinking before he spoke. His lips trembled. His voice cracked. No. The microphone carried only that single word. General Harrington tilted his head. My father shook it slowly. No, General. He looked toward me for the first time without pride, anger, or stubbornness. Only honesty. I didn't raise this woman. The auditorium became perfectly still. I raised a little girl. His breathing grew uneven. The woman standing up there. He wiped at his eyes with the back of one rough hand. America raised her. You could have heard a pin drop. My mother began crying openly. Grandma reached over and squeezed my father's hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he kept looking at me. I spent years believing she'd chosen the Army over her family. His voice was barely above a whisper. I never stopped to ask what the Army was asking of her. He looked around the auditorium. I thought promotions were just promotions. I thought medals were handed out. I thought combat happened to other people. His shoulders sagged. I was wrong. No one interrupted him. No one hurried him. The silence itself became a kind of respect. General Harrington stepped away from the podium and walked down the stairs until he stood only a few feet from my father. He extended his hand. My father looked surprised. Then he accepted it. The general spoke quietly enough that the room leaned forward to hear. Mr. Carter, your daughter spent years earning the respect of every soldier who ever served beside her. He smiled. Today you've earned mine. My father's eyes filled again. After the ceremony officially ended, families slowly gathered in the reception hall. There were coffee stations, photographs, handshakes, and conversations that had waited years to happen. Former soldiers approached me one after another. "Major, you probably don't remember me. I served with Bravo Company. You helped evacuate my squad. My daughter starts West Point next year because of you." Every story reminded me how connected military lives become. One retired sergeant introduced his teenage grandson. "I've told him about you for years." Another family brought photographs of a son who had survived the mountain rescue and now coached high school football in Colorado. While those conversations continued, my father remained several steps away. He never interrupted. He simply listened. For the first time, he heard complete strangers describe his daughter. Not as stubborn, not as rebellious, not as the girl who had disappointed him, but as a leader, a protector, someone they trusted when everything else had fallen apart. Each story seemed to chip away another piece of the wall he'd spent years building. Late that afternoon, as the crowd began thinning, I noticed him standing alone beside one of the Pentagon memorial displays. He stared at photographs of service members lost in different conflicts. He remained there so long that my mother eventually walked over. She rested her hand on his back. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Some truths require silence before words can catch up. That evening, everyone returned to the hotel. I stayed behind for meetings and paperwork. My parents rode the elevator without saying much. Grandma later told me my father barely touched his dinner. Back in his room, he sat in the dark beside the window overlooking Arlington. He replayed every conversation we'd ever had. Every birthday he criticized me for missing. Every promotion he dismissed. Every phone call he ended too quickly. Then inevitably his mind returned to one moment, his own voice echoing across Grandma's dining room. "Take that uniform off before you ever call me Dad again." For the first time in his life, Richard Carter realized those words hadn't humiliated me. They had revealed him. He didn't sleep that night. Just before sunrise, he made a decision. He quietly got dressed, left the hotel without waking anyone, and asked the front desk for my room number. A few minutes later, someone knocked softly on my door. I opened it. My father stood there alone. The knock came just after sunrise. Not loud, not urgent. 3 quiet taps that almost disappeared beneath the sound of traffic drifting across the Potomac River. For a moment, I simply stood inside my hotel room staring at the door. Something told me exactly who it was. When I opened it, my father stood in the hallway wearing the same sport coat from yesterday's ceremony. His shoulders looked lower than I had ever seen them. The confident posture that had carried him through decades of supervising factory workers had vanished. He looked older, not because another birthday had passed, because regret has a way of aging people overnight. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "May I come in?" I stepped aside. "Of course." He entered, slowly glancing around the modest room as though searching for the right words among the neatly folded uniforms, polished shoes, and military garment bag hanging near the window. I closed the door. Silence settled between us. I offered him the chair near the small desk. He sat. I remained standing for another moment before taking the chair across from him. The morning sun filtered through the curtains. Neither of us seemed eager to disturb it. At last my father spoke. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know." He nodded. I kept practicing what I wanted to say. He managed a weak smile. Turns out none of it sounded honest. I waited. He took a long breath. "When I was about your age, my father and I had an argument. That surprised me. My grandfather had died before I graduated high school. He had been a quiet man who rarely spoke about his own life. I wanted your grandfather to retire," Dad continued. "His knees were bad. The doctor told him the factory work was destroying what little cartilage he had left." He laughed softly. He looked at me and said, "Real men don't quit working." Dad rubbed his hands together. I argued with him for an hour. "What happened?" "He kept working." Dad looked down. And 3 months later, he collapsed on the production floor. I had never heard that story. My father believed a man had one purpose. He paused. "Work." Another pause. "When you were born?" His eyes finally met mine. I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I said nothing. Instead, his shoulders sagged. I made different ones. He leaned back and stared toward the window. "I spent so much time trying to protect you from what I feared that I never noticed who you were becoming." The room became quiet again. "I wasn't angry because you joined the army." He shook his head. "I was terrified." I frowned slightly. "Terrified? I watched Vietnam every night on television when I was young." He swallowed. "I watched neighbors come home different. I watched others never come home at all." He looked at his weathered hands. When you enlisted, all I could think was, one day someone might knock on my door carrying a folded flag. For the first time, I understood something about my father that had remained hidden my entire life. His anger had grown from fear. Fear left unspoken long enough eventually hardens into bitterness. I should have told you that. Instead, I criticized every promotion, every deployment, every decision. He wiped at his eyes. It seemed easier than admitting I was scared. I let those words settle. Then I quietly answered, I was scared too. He looked up immediately. You were... I smiled sadly. Every deployment, every mission, every time I watched helicopters lift off. I was scared. He blinked. I thought officers weren't supposed to feel fear. He nodded. I couldn't help smiling. Dad, the brave soldiers are usually the ones who admit they're afraid. It's the careless ones who think nothing can happen. He stared at me. I never knew. No. You never asked. The words weren't spoken with anger, just honesty. He accepted them. I deserved that. I leaned forward. Do you know what I remember most from overseas? I always assumed firefights. I shook my head. No, I told him about the young private who cried because he had missed his daughter's first birthday. The sergeant who carried photographs of his grandchildren inside his helmet. The medic who called his mother every Sunday no matter where we were. The lieutenant who proposed to his girlfriend over a satellite phone because he didn't know if he'd make it home. They weren't superheroes. They were ordinary Americans. Teachers. Mechanics, farm kids, nurses, students. They just happened to wear uniforms. Dad listened without interrupting. Then I spoke about the memories I usually kept locked away. The folded flags, the memorial ceremonies, writing letters to parents whose sons wouldn't be coming home, calling wives, holding soldiers together after losing friends. I still remember every name. My voice caught for the first time. I probably always will. Dad lowered his head. I complained because you missed birthdays. I nodded. You missed funerals. I nodded again. I accused you of abandoning family. He covered his face with both hands. When all along, you were protecting someone else's. Neither of us spoke for nearly a full minute. Sometimes silence says everything. Finally, my father stood. He walked to the window overlooking Arlington National Cemetery in the distance, rows upon rows of white headstones stretched across the hillside. He whispered almost to himself. I've spent 15 years measuring your life by everything the Army took from us. He turned toward me. I never once measured it by everything you gave. Tears rolled freely down his face now. He didn't try to hide them. I'm sorry. The words came out broken. So terribly sorry. I stood and crossed the room. For a second, we simply faced each other. Then, for the first time since I was a teenager, my father wrapped his arms around me. He held on tightly. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words hit harder than any medal I had ever received. I closed my eyes. Thank you. When we finally stepped apart, he laughed awkwardly. I have one more question. Anything? He looked embarrassed. I've watched soldiers salute for years. I smiled. So have I. But, he hesitated. I've never actually learned how. A small laugh escaped me. You want me to teach you? He nodded. If you'll let me. I picked up my service cap from the desk. All right. We moved into the open space near the window. I demonstrated slowly. Stand straight. He copied me. Feet together. He adjusted. Raise your right hand. He tried. Not quite right. I gently repositioned his elbow. There. He looked almost like a nervous recruit. Now bring your fingertips to the edge of your eyebrow. He did. I smiled. Perfect. He held the salute for several seconds. Then, with tears still shining in his eyes, he looked directly at me. This isn't for Major Carter. His voice steadied. This is for my daughter. He rendered the cleanest salute he could manage. Instinctively, I returned it. In that quiet hotel room overlooking the nation's capital, the distance of 15 painful years finally began to disappear. Neither of us noticed my mother standing just outside the slightly open door. She had come looking for us. Instead of interrupting, she quietly watched us through tears before slipping away to tell Grandma. Months later, back in our hometown, Veterans Day arrived. None of us knew that one final ceremony still awaited our family, or that my father's next salute would be witnessed by the entire community. Veterans Day arrived with one of those crisp Kentucky mornings that seemed made for remembering. The maple trees lining Main Street had turned shades of red and gold. American flags hung from storefront windows. The high school marching band warmed up in the parking lot behind the courthouse, their instruments sending scattered notes through the cool November air. Veterans wearing caps embroidered with the names of wars and ships gathered outside the American Legion Hall, greeting one another with handshakes that needed very few words. It had been almost 6 months since the ceremony at the Pentagon. Life hadn't become perfect overnight. Real healing rarely does. My father and I talked on the phone every Sunday now. At first, the conversations lasted only a few minutes. We discussed the weather football scores and my latest assignment. Gradually, they became longer. Sometimes he asked questions about Army life. Sometimes he admitted he still didn't understand certain things. That was all right. Understanding begins with the willingness to listen. He had also started volunteering twice a week at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. He drove older veterans to medical appointments at the VA clinic in Nashville, helped organize food drives, and spent hours simply listening to stories from men and women whose service had long gone unnoticed. One afternoon he told me, "I think I've learned more sitting in that hall than I did in the last 30 years. I believed him. When the town announced its annual Veterans Day ceremony, the mayor invited me to be the guest speaker. I almost declined. Public speaking had never bothered me in military settings, but speaking in my hometown felt different. These were the people who had watched me grow up. The people who remembered me delivering newspapers, working at the grocery store after school, and pitching softball on summer evenings. Grandma settled the matter. "Honey," she said over the phone, "sometimes people need to hear the truth from someone they already know." So I accepted. By 10 o'clock that morning, folding chairs filled the courthouse lawn. Families bundled in jackets. School children held tiny American flags. The local scout troop helped elderly veterans find their seats. A bugler stood quietly near the memorial honoring residents who had never returned from war. I spotted my parents sitting together in the front row. For the first time in my life, my father smiled the moment he saw me. Not a hesitant smile, a proud one. The ceremony began with prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance and recognition of veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and peacetime service. When my name was announced, I stepped to the podium and looked across faces that had become familiar long before I ever wore a uniform. I've been asked many times what military service has taught me. I began. I usually answer with words like discipline, teamwork, or sacrifice. I paused. But those aren't the lessons that stay with you the longest. The crowd listened quietly. The deepest lessons come from ordinary moments. A soldier sharing his last bottle of water. A medic refusing to rest until everyone else has been treated. A young private calling home just to hear his mother's voice. I told them about the importance of serving something greater than ourselves. Not just in uniform, in classrooms, churches, hospitals, factories, farms, small businesses, communities like ours. Marvin, I said, isn't measured only by where you work. It's measured by how faithfully you care for other people. I saw several older veterans nodding. Then I looked toward my father. There was a time when someone very close to me didn't understand why I chose this life. The audience remained still. I've learned that misunderstanding often grows where conversations stop. If we keep talking, if we keep listening, hearts can change. Applause followed. I thought my speech had ended exactly where it should. Then the mayor approached me quietly. "Major Carter." "Yes, sir." "Your father asked if he might say a few words." I looked toward Dad. He seemed almost as surprised as I was. He stood slowly and walked to the podium. No prepared notes. No rehearsed speech. Just an ordinary man carrying extraordinary humility. He adjusted the microphone. "I've spent most of my life believing fathers were supposed to teach their children." A soft chuckle moved through the crowd. He smiled faintly. I discovered I still had plenty to learn myself. His eyes found mine. "Several months ago, I said something to my daughter that I wish I could take back every day." He drew a long breath. "I told her to take off her uniform before she ever called me Dad again." A murmur spread through the audience. Dad didn't try to excuse himself. I was wrong. Completely wrong. He looked around at the veterans seated before him. "I thought that uniform had taken my daughter away." He shook his head. "The truth is, it helped make her into the woman standing here today." His voice grew stronger. "And not just my daughter. She's someone else's commanding officer. Someone else's source of courage. Someone families trust to bring their loved ones home." He paused, struggling to hold back emotion. "I used to believe strength meant never admitting you were mistaken." He smiled through tears. "I've learned real strength begins the moment you do." The crowd rose to its feet. Not because he had been perfect, because he had been honest. My father turned toward me. "In front of this town, in front of my family, and in front of every veteran here, I'm sorry." He stepped away from the microphone. I met him halfway across the stage. Without saying a word, we embraced. The applause seemed to go on forever. Later that afternoon, families gathered for coffee and homemade pie inside the American Legion Hall. Older veterans shared stories from decades earlier. Children climbed onto grandparents' laps. Neighbors laughed together. Grandma hugged both of us so tightly we could hardly breathe. "I've been praying for this day," she whispered. My father continued volunteering long after Veterans Day ended. He became one of the strongest supporters of military families in our county. Whenever a young woman told him she was considering military service, he smiled proudly and answered, "If that's where your heart leads, you serve with honor." People sometimes ask whether I got revenge on my father. They expect some dramatic ending, some final victory. But life rarely works that way. The greatest revenge was never making him suffer. It was allowing the truth to replace the misunderstanding that had ruled our family for years. Watching pride become humility. Watching judgment become respect. Watching a father rediscover his daughter. If this story has taught me anything, it's that the hardest battles are often fought at home, not overseas. We cannot change yesterday's words, but we can choose tomorrow's actions. If someone in your life has been misunderstood, don't wait for years to begin the conversation. Pride builds walls. Humility builds families. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, please share it with others who might need the same reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet strength found in ordinary Americans, I'd be honored if you stayed with us and subscribed. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating an enemy. It's finding your way back to each other.